On the morning of September 15, 1992, a sign of ultimate permanency would have been visible to anybody standing outside the towering stone fortress of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street in London. The Old Lady of Threadneedle Street has protected the British economy for 3 centuries. The foundation of the British Empire rested on this rock. It had funded the campaigns that toppled both Napoleon and Hitler. It was in charge of the money that once controlled a fifth of the world. There was more to the pound sterling than meets the eye. It symbolized the nation's character. It represented the steadiness and national pride of the British people. Fear, however, was starting to take hold inside the fortified stone walls on that dreary morning in September. The pinstripe suit-clad bankers had insider knowledge that the curious onlookers outside were unaware of. The bank was being attacked, and they knew it. Neither a land nor naval invasion was targeting them. They were not targets of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, an unseen, soundless, and much more powerful force than any army was launching its assault on them. The financial markets were launching an assault on them. George Soros was the particular target of their pursuit. George Soros did not hold the positions of politician or general. Even though he was 3,000 miles away, the 62-year-old hedge fund manager was seated in an office in a Manhattan tower. Tanks were not under his command. Money was his command. In addition, he had deduced that the British Empire was playing a deceitful game on this specific week in 1992. He had come to the conclusion that the British pound's value was an illusion. Furthermore, he was prepared to risk $10 billion in order to demonstrate it. History is rarely a straight line. It is a series of calculated risks and hidden agendas. If you find these deep dives into the forces that shape our world valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. It helps us continue uncovering the untold stories of empires and economies. Now back to the narrative. Black Wednesday's backstory is this. This is the account of the most massive bank heist that has ever taken place. In it, we learn how the actions of one merchant led to the downfall of the British Empire and the ceding of its economic independence. It tells the tale of the day when the 19th and 20th centuries merged into the 20th. Going back to the late 1980s political climate in Europe will help us comprehend why a hedge fund manager believed he could break the Bank of England. That was the end of the Cold War. Berlin Wall has come tumbling down. A tremendous sense of hope pervaded the atmosphere. The European countries, which had fought one another for ages, decided that the best way to avoid another conflict was to integrate their economies into one unbreakable whole. The system they devised is known as the exchange rate mechanism, or the ERM. The European Monetary Union, EZM, was an attempt to establish a monetary union across Europe. It laid the groundwork for the euro, the modern unified currency. The plan was simple. In this scenario, all of Europe's currencies would be interdependent. The British pound, the Spanish beta, the Italian lira, and then the French franc would all be tied to one another. Like a fleet of ships moored to a single anchor, they would rise and fall in unison. That mooring was the German mark. Germany was Europe's economic superpower. Notoriety for strict fiscal policymaking came from the country's central bank, the Bundesbank. Inflation was deeply despised by the Germans. The hyperinflation of the 1920s, when bread cost wheelbarrows of cash, had left an indelible mark on them. As a result, the German mark remained robust and steady thanks to the Bundesbank. That stability was something that other European nations wished they could import. They hoped to steal Germany's reputation. Under Margaret Thatcher's leadership, Britain became a member in October 1990. John Major, who succeeded her, was a firm believer, notwithstanding her reservations. Inflation had been a problem for Britain for a long time, and he thought that tying the pound to the German mark would help. The exchange rate was fixed by the British government at 2.95 German marks to the pound. They assured the world that they would protect this rate no matter what. According to them, the pound will always remain above 2.77 marks. A sand line was all that was there. However, a catastrophic defect existed in the system, which George Soros would subsequently take advantage of. The concept was predicated on the idea that all European nations would experience identical economic demands simultaneously. It was predicated on the idea that Britain would likewise benefit from what benefited Germany. That presumption collapsed in 1992. Germany was left footing the bill, while the rest of Europe reveled in the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The cost of bringing West and East Germany back together was enormous. To repair the East Germany's deteriorating infrastructure, the German government spent billions. As usual, the German central bank took measures to ensure that this expenditure would not lead to inflation. Interest rates were pushed up. An economy feels the pinch of high interest rates. They provide a sense of calm. In 1992, Germany's high interest rates were quite reasonable. However, Britain suffered greatly due to high interest rates. German economic growth was outpacing Britain's. The recession in Britain was severe. Employment was dwindling for many. Many homeowners were having trouble making their mortgage payments. Companies were declaring bankruptcy. In order to spur growth and make borrowing cheaper, the central bank often lowers interest rates during economic recessions. Low borrowing rates were an absolute need for Britain. Britain was unable to lower rates due to its membership in the ERM. To take advantage of Germany's better yields, investors would dump the pound and purchase the mark if Britain were to decrease rates. The pound's worth would decline. Furthermore, the pound could not decline in value as per the ERM's regulations. England was therefore ensnared in a gilded shackle. In order to preserve its membership in the European club, the British government had to artificially maintain a currency exchange rate by keeping interest rates very high, causing suffering to its own people. Despite the cries of the British economy for help, leaders in the country have restrained themselves. George Soros is here. Before he became interested in finance, Soros studied philosophy. As a child, he managed to escape the Nazi occupation of Hungary, where he learned the hard way that people in charge may be deceitful and that institutions are easily broken. A hypothesis he came up with is known as reflexivity. Markets are inefficient because of reflexivity, to put it simply. People make errors, and markets are no exception. On occasion, the markets put their faith in an untrue narrative. When the discrepancy between the two becomes too great, the whole structure falls apart. Soros saw a huge discrepancy between the fiction and reality when he examined the British pound in the summer of 1992. Supposedly, according to John Major of the Bank of England, the pound was robust and steady, valued at over 3 German marks. As things were, high interest rates were ruining the British economy and were the only thing keeping the pound from falling. With Quantum Fund's chief analyst Stanley Den Miller at his side, Soros sat in his office. Perceiving long-term patterns in the economy was Den Miller's strong suit. The situation was untenable, he informed Soros. He compared Britain to a guy who is holding his breath while submerged in water. After a time, he has to come up for air, but for now, he can do it. When the British government finally lowered interest rates, the value of the pound would plummet. Being a one-way bet was the trade's attractiveness. Even if Soros lost a little sum due to transaction fees, if his wager against the pound was incorrect, the worst-case scenario would be for the British government to maintain the pound's stability. He stood to gain a substantial fortune, nevertheless, if his prediction of a pound collapse came true. It was a bet with almost no downside and perhaps endless upside. Though Soros wasn't the only one keeping tabs, it was starting to smell like blood in the international financial market. The ERM was scrutinized by global hedge funds, banks, and currency speculators who detected its weaknesses. It all started with the Italian LRA. As early as the month of September, the LRA was attacked. The botched defense effort cost the Italian central bank billions of euros. The value of the LRA dropped. For Soros, this was the signal that had been pending. Britain may also collapse if Italy did. On September 15th, the incident occurred. The German Bundesbank president, Helmut Schlesinger, spoke with the Wall Street Journal in an interview published in a German publication. The disciplinary in Schlesinger was rather severe. The constant backing of weak currencies, such as the pound and the lira, had worn him down. Although he was cautious, he did drop a clue throughout the interview. A realignment of currencies may be necessary, he said, for the system to remain in operation. The term pound was not spoken by him, but its meaning was understood by everybody. Basically, what he was trying to convey was that the German central bank had no intention of intervening to save the British pound. The markets were given the green light to attack because of him. It was like a starting gun going off when the news wires in New York reported this interview. George Soros's office was entered by Stanley Duncan Miller. According to him, Schlesinger's remarks served as the first spark. It was his suggestion that they boost their wager against the pound. They had a stake of around 1.5 billion back then. The idea was put out by Derek Miller to increase it to 3 or 4 billion. As they locked eyes, Soros said a phrase that would go down in financial history as a classic. If you are right, then you can't be just a little bit right. You have to go for the jugular. Soros had advised him to stake everything. Leverage the entire fund, he instructed. He instructed him to sell sterling worth 10 billion. War broke out that night in the quantum fund. They started contacting financial institutions worldwide. Everyone they could borrow from gave them British pounds. They took out loans from financial institutions in the US, the UK, and Japan. The pounds were promptly exchanged for German marks. Here, familiarity with the short sales mechanics is key. Borrowing an asset that he did not legally own, Soros planned to sell it at its present high price, wait for its price to fall, and then purchase it back at a lower price to return it to the lender. His profit would be the difference. Soros in the market had amassed a huge tidal wave of sell orders for titles by the time Wednesday, September 16th, came to a dawn over London. They were moving pounds at a rate no one could keep track of. A phone call roused Norman Lamont, Chancellor of the Exchequer, from his slumber inside the British Treasury. We got some horrible news. Upon opening a few hours earlier, the Asian markets began to see the pound fall. The salesman never stopped. When it came to the British economy, Lamont was in charge. Despite his intelligence, he found himself in an untenable situation. On his way to Whitehall, he stopped by the Treasury building. It was a gloomy scene. This day would represent the pinnacle of testing, and the authorities knew it. About $40 billion worth of foreign cash was stashed away in their war chest. They intended to purchase the pounds being sold by Soros and others with this sum of money. By purchasing their own currency, they intended to maintain its value. There has been success with this tactic in the past. Financial institutions with a central bank are formidable. Typically, they are able to dominate markets, but they had never seen one so large or so combative. Markets in London opened at 8:30 a.m. A swift intervention was made by the Bank of England. Financial market participants started purchasing pounds by the hundreds of millions. As a show of force, they yelled out purchase orders across the phone lines. Whenever the Bank of England gets involved, the market usually stops moving. Investors feel threatened. Avoiding conflict with the government is their goal. However, the market did not halt this morning. It remained still. The hedge funds sold 2 million pounds for every million pounds that the Bank of England acquired. Selling was Soros's job. Another group of hedge funds was selling. When large companies like BP and Ford saw the value of the pound decline, they began liquidating their cash reserves as a precaution. A stampede had occurred. The pace at which the Bank of England was depleting its reserves was alarming. Picture yourself on a beach, attempting to use a bucket to stem the tide. The bank was acting in such manner. They were effectively giving George Soros billions of pounds in public funds from Britain. It became evident that intervention was ineffective by 10 hours in the morning. The ERM trading band floor was the pound's shackle. Just above the 2.77 point, it was circling. Britain would be in breach of the pact if it dropped below that. The bank executives and Norman Lamont met for a crisis briefing. The need to escalate became apparent to them. Interest rates were their primary tool. Increasing the value of the currency to retain it in reserve was the next logical step if purchasing it failed. Speculators would be enticed to purchase pounds to earn the interest. Thus, they had to boost interest rates so high. The Bank of England surprised the market by raising interest rates at 10:30 in the morning. A 12% base rate was instituted, up from 10% before. The idea of a 2% increase in a single day is quite rare. Back in the day, that would send the value of the currency soaring. For some reason, Lamont was hoping this would be the last straw that would make Soros duck for cover. No, the market didn't skyrocket. The stock market scoffed. When the rate rise was presented, the traders failed to see any strength. There was an air of despair that they saw. What they saw was a government in a state of panic. The British economy was already weak, and they knew it. 10% mortgage rates were already a hot topic among homeowners, which they were aware of. They were well aware that a political upheaval would ensue if rates were raised to 12%. They were aware that the government couldn't keep it up for much more than a few days. Therefore, the market sold even more instead of purchasing pounds. They saw the rate increase as a sign that the animal was about to die. The pound's value hardly budged. It remained mired at the base. The rate rise made George Soros happy in New York. To him, it was obvious that he had triumphed. Things become dicey when the market disregards a government action of such magnitude. Keep selling, he instructed Druckenmiller. Prime Minister John Major was seeing the collapse of his career from Downing Street. He had bet his name on the guy, that man. He assured the nation that the pound will be strong in his commitment. The nation's wealth was being siphoned off by speculators, and he was powerless to stop it. The Treasury, the Bank of England, and Downing Street were all on high alert by phone. All other choices had been exhausted. They were about to run out of cash. Just a few hours had cost them billions. This is when the British government started acting like a shipwreck crew, trying to save themselves by discarding their belongings. Trading may be halted if they so desired. Bank closures were being discussed, yet they were well aware that doing so would jeopardize London's standing as a global financial hub. They only had the nuclear option as a last resort. They chose to increase interest rates once again. The Bank of England announced a second rate rise at 2:15 in the afternoon of the same day. There was a 12% increase to a 15% rate, 1 in 5. It was a terrifying statistic for everyone in the UK who had a mortgage or loan. Countless individuals would face financial ruin if that rate remained in place. Financially, it was a disaster. The government's goal was that the market would just blink from astonishment at the enormity of the hoax. There was no escaping the market, however. Traders could see it was a deception. They were aware that John Major would be ousted from government if he maintained rates at 15%. We continued to get sell orders. Pound depreciation persisted. The clock has run out. It had cost the Bank of England billions. Their rates had been driven to absurd heights. The pound continued its downward spiral. The free market triumphed against the strength of the British Empire in this epic battle. The weary Treasury officials laid down their phones as the afternoon progressed. All options had been exhausted. There were no more pounds to be purchased. They were unable to increase charges anymore. They gave up and capitulated. A conference at Admiralty House reached the conclusion. The gathering of top ministers and John Major Norman Lamont was marked by a solemn atmosphere. They reached an agreement to temporarily remove Britain from the ERM. By allowing the pound to float, they were essentially inviting its collapse. Norman Lamont emerged from the Treasury to confront a throng of cameras around 7:30 in the evening. His face became white and trembling. He perused a brief announcement that announced the cancellation of interest rate rises and Britain's withdrawal from the exchange rate mechanism. The whole ordeal was embarrassing. Trading ceased in New York for George Soros and his group. A huge short position has been opened for the day. In the days that followed, the pound's decline allowed them to repurchase their borrowed currency at a steep discount. Their profit was the differentiating factor. After all was said and done, George Soros had profited more than $1 billion in only one day. The Bank of England had been shattered by him alone. The narrative of Black Wednesday, however, goes beyond monetary matters alone. The change in power is at the heart of everything. At that instant, people all across the globe understood that governments had lost control of the banking system. The traders' electronic flock managed it. The first portion has come to a close. Part 2 will take place inside the trading rooms, where we will see the day's minute-by-minute mayhem. In this article, we'll take a look at the political aftermath that tarnished the Conservative Party's image for a whole generation. And we'll examine the peculiar irony that the British economy may have benefited more than anything else from Black Wednesday. We shall see how this catastrophe paved the way for the contemporary financial system and prevented Britain from joining the euro. Although the fighting had ended, the struggle for Europe's destiny had only just started. Even when the sun went down on September 16, 1992 in London, hardly one in the financial area left their offices. The city was alive with a disorganized energy that seemed more like a revolution's aftermath than a typical business day. Traders were rejoicing in London's taverns and wine bars. As they sipped their champagne, a group of boisterous, adrenaline-fueled young guys wore suspenders and shirt sleeves. They had just become quite wealthy. The currency of their own nation was gambled against and ultimately won. However, at the solemn Whitehall offices across town, the atmosphere was explosive. Globally, the British government had taken a beating. The emblem of imperial stability, the Bank of England, had been broken into and robbed in New York by a group of speculators headed by a philosopher from Hungary. We need to examine the figures to grasp the magnitude of the destruction. Over £3 billion of public funds were used by the Bank of England in its futile effort to preserve the pound. There was no transaction of 33 billion pounds. There was an absolute loss of 3 billion pounds. George Soros and other hedge fund managers had their hands filled with money straight out of the British public coffers. Hundreds of hospitals might have been constructed, or the whole British Army could have been supported for months with 3 billion pounds in 1992. Within one afternoon, it was disappeared. Legend has it that that day's trading floors were a veritable circus. A sense of unreality was reported by traders. The currency price panels were flashing red, and the phones were ringing non-stop with orders from customers yelling, "Sell, sell, sell." Typically, a penny's worth of coin may change hands. The pound was losing a full penny every few minutes on Black Wednesday. The descent was completely unfettered. Someone who worked as a trader for a large British bank remembers yelling at their broker to sell 50 million pounds. "No purchasers were found," the broker yelled back. "An unstable knife? Who would purchase such a thing? Only the Bank of England purchased it." Amidst a deluge of sellers, the bank was the lone bidder left standing. The instructions from the bank were visible to the merchants. The line at 277 marks is being held by enormous round numerals. The market would gobble up those orders in an instant. They could see it coming. Witnessing a lion being consumed by ants was a frightening experience. The political bunker was the site of the most pivotal events. Both mentally and physically, Prime Minister John Major was worn out. He had wasted the day engaged in an unwinnable struggle. Rumor has it that he once locked himself in his room and stared blankly at the wall. The news reportedly shocked his chancellor, Norman Lamont. He had to rescind the politically suicide-inducing decision to hike interest rates to 15% only hours after making it. As the enemy grinned, he had successfully led the British soldiers up the hill and then back down again. That evening, Lamont delivered a capitulation speech outside the Treasury that would go down in British political history as a watershed event. An obnoxious heckler from the audience raised an audible question as he stood there, flashes illuminating his face, acknowledging that Britain was departing from them. The interest rates were making his wife and kids crazy, so he yelled at them. Lamont appeared ethereal. He was well aware that his credibility as an economy expert had taken a major hit. George Soros was counting his winnings as London was reeling from New York. A profit of almost $1.1 billion had been generated by the Quantum Fund. However, there were others besides Soros. Paul Tudor Jones, Bruce Keener, and other well-known traders also made hundreds of millions. As far as Wall Street is concerned, he was the largest payday ever. In an instant, Soros rose to fame. He was crowned the man who broke the Bank of England by the press. The British tabloids made fun of him. His portrayal was that of a vicious criminal, an alien predator who had plundered the British people. Unrepentant, nevertheless, was Soros. In his defense, he maintained that he was innocent. He took part in the market. He placed a wager against an incorrectly priced item. He said the British government was to blame because it disregarded economic logic. He said that the lawmakers might have saved billions of pounds in depreciation costs if they hadn't been so obstinate. Despite the gruesome nature of the operation, he felt he had done what was required for a sick patient. The political landscape of the United Kingdom was shaken for decades following Black Wednesday. Conservatives, who had long taken pleasure in being the party with the most fiscally responsible policies, never got back on their feet. The power of John Major was shattered. Despite his obvious decline, he managed to remain prime minister for an additional few years. After 18 years of conservative dominance, Tony Blair's Labour Party scored a resounding win in 1997. People rejected the Conservatives in large part because of the events of Black Wednesday. Historians and economics are now debating a peculiar irony that adds a twist to this narrative. There was no complete collapse of the British economy in the days and weeks after Black Wednesday. Truly, it made a resounding boom. Britain was free once it left the ERM. The need to artificially raise interest rates in order to appease Germany was removed. Instantly, interest rates were lowered by the government. They dropped from an absurd 15% to 6% in just a few months. Homeowners and business owners felt a tremendous sense of relief. British products become more affordable globally due to the depreciation of the pound. More automobiles and heavy equipment were being sold by British manufacturers. Quick expansion of the economy started happening. The term golden economic legacy arose to describe this time in history. Black Wednesday was really White Wednesday, according to many economists these days. Forcibly evicted from the EU was, in their view, Britain's finest possible outcome. A worsening recession was averted as a result. It demonstrated the folly of attempting to bind one's economy to that of another nation. This insight significantly impacted Europe's trajectory going forward. Britain was an exception in the late 1990s, when the rest of Europe was getting ready to introduce the euro, its unified currency. People were still reeling from the horrors of Black Wednesday. When the British people and their representatives considered the euro, they saw yet another trap. What occurred when they couldn't manage their own interest rates was something they recalled. Britain opted out of joining the euro because of George Soros. Even if Spain, Italy, France, and Germany all ditched their own currencies in favor of the euro, Britain retained the pound. The events of the 21st century have been defined by this choice. The 2016 Brexit referendum may not have taken place if Britain had been a euro member. If the UK had stayed, its economy would have been inseparable from the European Union's. So in an odd sense, George Soros altered the course of a nation's fate rather than just destabilizing a bank. By making the pound sterling collapse, he preserved it. Central banks also had to adapt their methods as a result of that day's aftermath. In the years leading up to 1992, central bankers had the view that they ruled the world. They foolishly believed that a simple edict could determine the value of their money. They learned humility on Black Wednesday. It showed them that in today's interconnected world, governments don't have nearly as much money as the financial markets. You are helpless in the face of a market downturn. Embrace the unknown. A lot has changed in how the Bank of England functions recently. Instead than concentrating on currency rates, it aims to curb inflation. It keeps the market in the loop to forestall unpleasant shocks. The previous haughtiness has given way to a measured reverence for the influence of the unseen hand. Later in life, George Soros became a prominent philanthropist who donated billions of dollars to organizations that advocated for free and fair communities globally. However, many people still find him divisive. Some people think he's a genius investor who exposed politicians' ineptitude. According to some, he's a risky investor who caused a nation's instability for financial gain. The events of September 16, 1992 were a watershed moment in history, regardless of your opinion of him. On that day, the stock markets officially broke apart from the government. That was the day the digital flock crushed the dinosaurs. Looking back at the film of that tumultuous day, at the sweaty politicians and the yelling merchants, we can see the beginning of the modern world. In this hypothetical future, a single individual armed with nothing more than a computer and a strong belief in something may defeat a whole empire. Threadneedle Street is still home to the Bank of England. Its walls remain substantial. Its depths have not diminished. However, the air of invincibility has dissipated. A world-changing wager broke it on a September Wednesday. The memory of that fateful day lingers in the halls of power, serving as a constant reminder to all prime ministers and chancellors that the market is always vigilant and that it is never long until the market is proven incorrect. Instead of a climax, a dealer sold 10 billion units of a hope that had long since faded away, and that was the day the imperial pound perished. A new icy world governed by statistics arose in its stead.